Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Ask Me Anything, the 2025 Tariffs. I want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dave Noah and I am President of Shipping Solutions. Since 1995, our compliance software has helped thousands of international trade professionals stay compliant with import-export regulations. To help educate our customers in the wider international trade community, we regularly host free webinars like this one on the various aspects of international trade. This Ask Me Anything webinar is a follow-up to our May 7th webinar, the 2025 Tariffs Framework, Facts, and Forecasts. During that hour, our expert Adams Lee gave us an excellent summary of where we stood at that moment with the various special tariffs the Trump administration has implemented and announced. And of course, there have been changes since then, including new changes last night. So we will give a brief summary of those today. Now, we did set aside some time last time for questions during last month's webinar, but we ran out of time before we got to them all. So today, Adams has generously agreed to come back and devote most of this hour to answering some of the questions we didn't have time to get to, as well as take new questions that you can submit today. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Adams Lee is an accomplished international lawyer with more than 20 years of experience in providing strategic legal advice on complex trade and regulatory matters to U.S. and foreign companies, trade associations, and governments. His extensive knowledge covers a broad range of industries where he has developed strong arguments to advance client interests, effectively manage risks, and create competitive opportunities in both U.S. and global markets. And we'll have a link to his longer bio and his company website in the materials we send out as well. And we're going to start with the questions that were left over from last time and an update on what's going on. So I'm going to turn it over to Adams, and go ahead, Adams, you go ahead and start, and just let me know when you would want me to advance the slides.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Happy to be back here. We had a really good turnout in our last month's webinar, and a lot of good questions because everyone's trying to figure out what's going on with all these tariffs, and every company's got a unique situation. So a really strong showing in terms of the questions. Fortunately, we didn't have enough time to cover them all. So what I've tried to do is group the remaining questions to try to get as much coverage of those remaining questions. And there's basically, 4 or 5 different categories. A lot of these questions have to do trying to figure out, what's the country of origin, if I'm trying to get out of China. A lot of questions to what extent can we use Canada and Mexico as an option? Does USMCA help since they have a favorable tariff rate compared to everyone else? Other sets are going to ask about valuation. A lot of ways, how can I minimize my product value to try to reduce the tariff hit, and how far can I go in terms of reducing that value? And then a lot of questions on stacking, so many different tariff options. And yesterday, President Trump announced an increase of the steel tariffs going from 25% to 50%. And he also made a change in how the stacking exemptions work. So we'll go through a little bit of that as well. And then another set of questions, just how many of these tariffs are eligible for duty drawback? Can I get a refund on some of these tariffs? And under what kind of circumstances can I do so? So let's roll into next set of questions. If you have any of these questions in that fall in these categories, hopefully I can address them. But if you have a follow-up question, feel free to type them in, and we can go over them there. And if you don't see a topic that you need addressed, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A as well. Okay, so country of origin had these three questions kind of grouped together, and they were pretty representative of a lot of the other questions. So the first one is if we have a new vendor, Vietnam, other countries, and their products originate in new countries, how do we tell? Are they really from that other country and they're not just transshipped Chinese goods? A lot of these new factories are still using Chinese components, so they're asking, give us a quick summary of the discussion that we need to have with our vendors, just so that we can make sure we have a actual country of origin of not China. And then the second question is a more specific example. If we have a steel cylinder manufactured in China, we ship it to a UK facility, and in the UK, we install US made parts. It results in an HTS code change, and it becomes a fire extinguisher. Does this qualify to be China tariff exempt? And then the last question is, will CBP accept self-issued country of origin certificates or require the exporting country to certify the country of origin? So all of these are a lot, questions focusing on, how do I determine the country of origin of my product? How do I make sure that it's not China country of origin? So the key to most of these questions is there a substantial transformation in the final country in which the finished goods is produced? So if there's enough processing in the third country that results in a new product, and that's defined as a new product that results in a change in name, use, or character, that will be a substantial transformation. Now, CBP does not have a mathematical formula. They don't use a percentage of cost. They don't look at the weight of there's no simple formula because, substantial transformation applies to everything, all products. So they can't use a percentage figure because that percentage, weight, cost, value basis formula wouldn't apply evenly to all products. So instead, they do it on a case by case basis. They look at each product. They look at the parts involved, the processing involved. They'll look to see, does a certain part impart a essential character of the finished goods. So, for example, in one case, the courts have said, look, if you have parts that are made only for a flashlight, those parts can only be used to make a flashlight. So if all those parts are made in China and you move them over to, say, Malaysia and assemble all those Chinese parts into a flashlight, even though you're putting together the flashlight in Malaysia, the courts basically said, look, those parts are still Chinese and they have the essential character of a flashlight. So you're not really changing the essential characters of those parts when you assemble them in Malaysia. So they basically said, look, the country of origin of that flashlight is still China, even though you're assembling it in Malaysia.
We got a question today related to this. A vendor in the UK states that if the product is from China but was imported in the UK and stayed there for at least a year, this is enough to change the country of origin to the UK before exporting to the US. Is that correct?
Uh, no, I mean, just holding it in the UK doesn't change anything. I mean, it could be, it's still going to be focused on how were those parts um, processed in the UK. It doesn't matter how long that part was sitting in the UK. It's if it was a Chinese origin part and it happened to be sitting in the UK for, an extended period of time, that still wouldn't change CBP's analysis there. In this example here, the second one about the steel cylinders there, where Chinese steel cylinders are moved to the UK facility. It's added with US made parts, and it's turned into a fire extinguisher. That one probably would be a substantial transformation because, the steel cylinder um, probably isn't the essential character of the fire extinguisher, right? Because, the fire extinguisher needs a lot of the flame retardant chemicals. It needs, a delivery system to make sure it can go out there. So, just having a Chinese cylinder probably isn't as critical there. The fact that it results in a new HTS code, shows that it's a pretty significant change, that it's going from one product, a HTS code for a part to a totally different HTS code for a finished good of a fire extinguisher. The other wrinkle is that you've got US parts in there. There is a tariff exemption where if the US content of a good is more than 20%, you could get an exemption for the US content. So here, in this example, if the US parts account for more than 20% of the cost of the finished fire extinguisher, you might be able to get an exemption for the US portion of that fire extinguisher. And then the last question on this one on the country of origin certificates, CBP doesn't put a lot of value in those country of origin certificates of other countries, in part because they know that um, it's, you can buy those country of origin certificates in other countries, and, sometimes they're not really that valid, so like even if the Vatican issued a country of origin certificate, I'm not sure how much value, they would have, they would put on the Pope signing off on their country of origin certificates. CBP would still do their own analysis of country of origin. The other subset of country of origin questions deals with USMCA. Because USMCA compliant goods are at 0%, the they're trying to see, can we get USMCA compliant status in order to be exempt from most of the tariffs? So, second question there is, if we have US materials and we send them to Mexico to make a forging, and then the forging is exported from Mexico to the US and turned into another product, are there reciprocal tariffs under USMCA? Is it still considered a US origin? Second question, similar. If our steel is molded into a pre-engineered building in the US or Mexico, will that qualify under the USMCA? Um, for both of those questions, there's still a lot of missing, details on exactly what's being forged, and, where the parts are coming from and what's being done to them. But it looks like they're using only US or Mexican parts. So under that, it seems like it probably would be USMCA eligible, because goods that are wholly produced from content parts that are sourced only from US, Mexico, and Canada, those would be generally considered USMCA eligible. The tricky part is when you start using any third country materials. So you can use parts coming in from China, for example. Um, but you need to be really careful to make sure, in order to qualify for USMCA origin, there has to be a substantial transformation of those third country parts. And so, under USMCA, they use a tariff shift analysis to see, is there a substantial transformation? So, unlike the previous slide where there's more of a open-ended analysis for whether there's a substantial transformation, under USMCA rules, they're looking to see, is there specifically a tariff shift of the input parts with whatever is being produced and shipped out as the finished goods. There's also, with USMCA, there are some product specific regional content, regional cost requirements. Autos, trucks are the most notable requirements. In that one, USMCA content has to be at least 75%. They also, have requirements that the cars, trucks have to be at least 40 to 45% produced using high wage labor above a certain dollar per hour requirement. And then specifically for the steel or aluminum content, has to be sourced at least 70% from North American steel suppliers there. So USMCA is an option, but it's a really extensive record keeping requirement. So if you're going to go down and trying to get USMCA origin, um, if you're using third country inputs there, it can be a very document intensive process. And there are people who specialize in helping companies, manage that record keeping process necessary to get USMCA origin. Valuation, questions on what types of expenses can be paid separately and how do we show this on our commercial invoice? The fundamental question is it legal for us to break out a product's cost by the actual components versus the engineering R&D that went into it and only claim the actual parts and labor and costs as the customs declared value? So um, fundamentally, this question is what is the value of the product that needs to be reported to customs? And customs definition, there's a hierarchy of different valuation methods that you can use to declare a product when it's imported. Most products are declared using transaction value, and that's defined as the price actually paid or payable. So when a buyer, the US importer, pays anything to the seller, the exporter, that's usually the price actually paid or payable. It may be done in several installments. So anytime there's a money going from buyer to the seller, customs presumes that that's usually part of the price actually paid for that product. It definitely includes the cost of the materials, the labor, the energy used to produce the product. So those are definitely need to be still included. Um, the definition also says it includes assists, tools, dies, molds, any materials or component inputs, any engineering artwork designs that go in to produce the product. So um, this is where you start getting some gray areas where people can say, what exactly is an assist? You know, assists are something that's necessary for the production of the product. Now, you can have a mold that may be for general applications. It may not be specifically for a particular product, but could be used for multiple products. So there you have some gray areas like, well, to what extent is that particular mold for an assist for my product that I'm importing? And so there's a way that you can look at that and see maybe we could shave off some of the cost related to that particular mold because that assist is not necessarily for my product. Engineering R&D work is for R&D that's performed outside the U.S. If it's performed in the U.S., those R&D expenses would not necessarily be included in that price. So you could possibly exclude that. It would also include royalty and licensing fees, but only to the extent that they're a condition for the U.S. export sale. If you just have a general royalty or licensing fee separately, it may be possible that you can break this out. So we are doing a lot of work with companies trying to do a deep dive into what exactly is in the price that we're paying, and they're trying to figure out to what extent we can break things out and perhaps find a way to separately charge them so that, when they appear on the invoice, you can legitimately show a reduced price for the product, but then figure out if there's an alternative way to, say that we'll pay you for these different services that are not specifically related to the product. And that way we can sort of carve those out, still compensate the seller for those services, but if they're not, specifically tied to a product, maybe we can reduce our tariff hit on the specific product. So there are ways to do this, but there's has to be a pretty good commercial analysis for how you're breaking out these prices there. Next set of questions deals with stacking, trying to figure out what's the total hit on all these tariffs. We've got so many tariffs: 232, Section 301, all the IEEPA tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs. What do we add to get to our final bottom line tariff number? A lot of this is ever changing with the pauses. Most countries are paused until July 8th, but kick back in July 9th. China has a pause until early August. Yesterday, there was, the change in the steel tariffs, and that's changed some of these stacking rules. So I took a quick look at that, and hopefully I've got these updated here. But these are the questions. If a part is Canadian origin without USMCA and subject to Section 232 aluminum and the fentanyl tariffs, will both of them apply? Similarly, if there's an auto part and it's under both the auto parts 232 and the aluminum provisions, is it subject to only one of those tariffs? If it's USMCA eligible, is it not subject to the auto parts tariff and therefore subject to the aluminum tariffs? And those are USMCA specific, and then the bottom two are China specific ones. Any goods that are subject to the 232 tariffs, steel, aluminum, autos, are they exempt from the reciprocal tariffs? And then can you just go through all the stacking percentages for China to see if it's what's actually covered there? So next slide is the top line is a link to CBP's guidance for the stacking. That was good. I don't know if it's still good anymore as of yesterday's announcement. Originally, they put a hierarchy in terms of how to look at the tariffs. First, they say check to see is it covered by Section 232 autos and auto parts. If so, if it's covered by the auto 232 tariffs, then it's not covered by either the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs or the Section 232 steel aluminum. So if it's just autos, you're only subject to that. The sub part of that is if you're USMCA eligible, if you've got a USMCA origin product, then you can be exempt from the 232 tariffs. If you're exempt from the 232 tariffs, then, however, you could then still be subject to some of the reciprocal tariffs. If you're not covered by the Section 232, second step was for the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs for Canada and Mexico. If you're covered by those IEEPA fentanyl tariffs, then you're not covered by the Section 232 tariffs. Again, USMCA eligible products, they can be exempt from the Canada, Mexico fentanyl tariffs. And then number three, it used to be if it was eligible for steel and aluminum, then you were exempt from the other tariffs. And then also you were exempt from the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs. But that has changed. As of yesterday's announcement, he increased the steel aluminum tariffs to 50%. The change on the stacking, there's twofold. One is that um, he's removed the stacking exemption. So now, for products that are mixed materials, you can have products that are subject to the steel and aluminum. If the steel and aluminum content, that will have a 50% tariff hit to it. But the balance of that product will still be subject to the reciprocal tariffs. So that's one key change. The other change is in terms of the order. He's basically moved the steel and aluminum tariff up to the first line. So that's the first thing that you have to check for, is to see, are we subject to the steel 232 tariffs first? And then you look to see, are they covered by 232 auto parts tariffs, and then the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs. And then you check to see if they're subject to the reciprocal tariffs. The general rule right now, most countries are, holding at the 10% reciprocal tariffs. Um, uh, so that's kind of the baseline universal tariff that's being applied. All the country-specific reciprocal tariffs are on hold, at least until 12/01, July 9th. Trump is waiting for all the deals to be made. I think he's put a deadline of today, tomorrow, for all the countries to submit their last and best offers for the deals, and so we'll see what kind of deals come forward. He's cut a deal with the UK, but with the announcement of the Section 232 steel stuff, I think there are some UK steel manufacturers that are probably regretting that deal. So we'll see how it shakes out with all the deals that he's going to be making, hopefully. Um, the other stacking issue is, it only sorts out that provides some stacking exemptions for the second round tariffs. It does not exempt any stacking with any of the old Section 301 tariffs, anti-dumping CVD duties that may be out there, and then just the general HTS duties that apply to the products normally. Next slide are some specific examples for China. So here's all the different tariffs that can apply to China. Section 232 auto parts are 25%. The fentanyl for China is at 20%, and China does not have a stacking exemption, unlike Canada and Mexico. So that 20% is definitely going to be applied on all Chinese products there. The Section 232 is now at 50%, not just maybe, it's now definitely 50%. And then the IEEPA tariffs started at 10%. The reciprocal tariff was announced at 34%, and it's settled back down now. It's at 10%. And the kicker was all the retaliatory tariffs. Trump went as high as up to 125%, went back down to 84%. All those retaliatory tariffs are on hold now. So, for a basic example, if you have a China product that's not steel, aluminum, or auto parts, you would have it at 20% for the China fentanyl tariffs, and then the 10% for the reciprocal tariffs that right now. So you would be paying at least 30%. But the reality is, a lot of these products are still subject to the first term 301 tariff, so that's another 25% or 7.5%. And then a lot of these products, may be subject to anti-dumping duty. So we're looking probably at least 55%, if not more, for a lot of Chinese products. And then if you got a China steel or an auto part product, Now that Chinese steel is at 50%, and auto parts are at 25%, those would be added to 20% China fentanyl. Um, Before today, you would not add the 10% reciprocal tariffs, but now for the steel tariffs, you may need to add that 10% reciprocal tariffs on the non-steel parts of your components. So now we're looking at least 70%, 45%, but it could be 80% or 55%, depending on how the reciprocal tariffs get added in. Clear as mud, right? All right. So next set of questions dealing with drawbacks. So a lot of questions asking if we import components from China, do they still get tariffed, or can we get duty drawback if it's used in U.S. final production? If so, what tariffs can be eligible for duty drawback? What happens if the final product is not exported? Are there reimbursement programs available for tariffs paid on imported components for U.S. production? Um, the the fact that an imported component is used for U.S. production is not a criteria for eligibility for duty drawback. If so, then everything probably would be potentially eligible for duty drawback. So, you know, using your imported parts to make further manufacture, to do U.S. manufacturing, is not your golden ticket to get out of, to get duty drawback. To to qualify for duty drawback, you have to show that the imported product was not used, it was not consumed in the US, but instead it was actually just, imported as is, but exported in the same condition, and thus eligible for duty drawback. Basically, you cannot use or consume the imported product if you want to try to get duty drawback. Or you can show that you had to destroy the product. You couldn't sell it basically. So an example is like if you import jet engine parts and it's used by Boeing to manufacture a plane here, and it's that Boeing then sells that plane to a foreign airline. You can then try to claim duty drawback on the imported jet engine parts there. Another example of duty drawback is, hey, you imported a bunch of batting helmets, and customer looked at them and said, I'm not going to take them. They're a crack. They're defective. I can't buy them. So in the end, you either destroy them or return them to the seller. You can try to claim duty drawback on those. So you have up to 5 years to claim duty drawback. But for these tariffs, they specifically said duty drawback's not eligible for steel. The 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto parts. They're not eligible for the Canada, Mexico fentanyl tariffs, but they are eligible for the reciprocal tariffs, and the old Section 301 China tariffs are also eligible for duty drawback. So those are two tariff areas where you can get some tariff relief, but duty drawback is, again, similar to USMCA. It's a pretty document intensive process, and so going through that duty drawback exercise, does take a lot of patience to, put in the paperwork to get that refund. So I think that's pretty much all the slides there for all the questions from the first wave. So let's open it up for some new questions here.
So that first question on there is kind of a long one. We are a medical device manufacturer that imports raw materials for our finished products, and we export our finished products worldwide. Our export customers typically handle their own freight using ex-works. What documentation would we need to collect and provide to prove export of the finished good? And does it matter? And what are those programs, rebates, discounts that benefit U.S. manufacturers?
And then the second part of that question.
If we send it to South Korea and then they terminate us as a subcontractor and send it back to us, because the material originates from the U.S. and then comes back, is there any import guidelines to avoid the tariffs?
Okay, so two-part question. The first part on export customers. So most of these tariffs are just on imports. So they would not apply to exports. Exports are um, generally an issue for retaliatory tariffs. They're not an issue for any US tariffs because the US is not tariffing any exports going out of the country, just stuff coming into the US. So I don't think there are any tariff issues related to you know the exports going out.
Would the example you gave about the duty drawback for for an export that used imports that were then added to a product and then exported out is
That could be, right? I mean, I guess that is probably the one example where if you're trying to prove that the imported goods were, used in the manufacture of something that was exported, then yeah, I think that might be something where you'd have to fully show that everything that you imported, you could trace it through, you could show quantities imported were used to make X quantity of finished goods going out. And therefore, document that nothing, those parts ultimately did not enter US commerce, but instead they were ultimately exported. So maybe that is where, under duty drawback, you might want to, go through that exercise.
and then how about returning goods from South Korea or any other country? Is there a guidelines that a company should follow?
Yeah, so that one was probably like under my first slide where you would want to see, if the US content, the parts that go out to Korea, to the extent that what exactly are you doing with that part? Is it is the US content being substantially transformed in Korea? I don't know. I mean, it depends on what is the U.S. part, what's being done to it. If it's substantially transformed in Korea, it may be coming back as a Korean um, product. But if the U.S. component is, essential, it's basically, the finished good wouldn't function, wouldn't exist but for that U.S. component. Maybe you could say that that is a U.S. Origin product coming back, and that the assembly, the manufacturing in Korea is pretty minor, so it doesn't substantially transform the U.S. component in Korea. So we would probably need a lot more information on the products and the production process in Korea to make that country of origin determination.
Has there been changes to the way that a company should handle items that they have exported and then are being returned to the U.S. for repair or return?
For goods that are being repaired, returned, that's also a category in which you could that would might be eligible for tariff exemptions, but again, that's kind of just documenting. It's like, are you doing just minor repairs and corrections and things like that, and you're not essentially changing the true nature of the product there.
One of my products is under the HTS code of 8415 90 80 85. The country of origin is China. It contains a small percentage of aluminum. My question is, after June 4th, will duties be assessed based on reciprocal and Section 232? My understanding is that before June 4th, it was one or the other.
Correct. Before June 4th, it was either the Section 232 steel, aluminum tariffs was 25%, but now you have 50% on the percentage of the aluminum products, but then the balance of the product would now be subject to the 10% reciprocal tariffs. And don't forget to throw in the 20% China fentanyl tariffs as well. So, and then maybe there's also Section 301 tariffs from the first term as well too. I don't know specifically that HTS number, but there's a decent chance that that number could be subject to the old 301 tariffs as well.
So nothing but good news there.
Nothing but good news for China products.
Is there any, do you have any suggestions for guidance or trainings for navigating Section 232 and 301 tariffs, besides, of course, this webinar?
Man, I am a trade lawyer and I'm struggling to keep up with all the changes on the tariffs there. But in terms of what I'm looking at, I'm looking at the White House, announcements for the executive orders. I'm looking at CBP's, guidance. Those are the official, announcements of these tariffs. I'm checking all my colleagues in the trade bar. There's a lot of good professionals out there who are trying to figure out what's going on with the tariffs. So just trying to consult with a lot of my colleagues who I trust and respect, and together we'll hopefully get to a consensus on what's actually happening, and be able to provide guidance to everyone.
Okay. If our broker was to declare a product under a specific HTS code as exempt, although it's not on the annex list, is this a system error or should we file PSC?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. As we advise companies, customs is looking at the importer of record for, the as who's the company that's going to be responsible for the import entry declarations. So companies can hire brokers to help them make those entry declarations. The broker is just your agent. You, as the company, as the importer of record, are ultimately responsible for it. All the information that's declared to customs as being true and accurate. You may be relying on your broker to help you pick which is the HTS code that should apply. What's the country of origin? What's the valuation? But the broker is doing that based on information that you provide, and ultimately CBP is going to hold you, the importer of record, responsible, not the broker. So if you see something where, hey, the HTS is wrong, yeah, it would be on you to make sure you review your broker's work and just say, are you comfortable with the declarations that they've made on your behalf? If you see an HTS number and you don't think it's eligible to be exempt, yeah, you would tell your broker, hey, I think it is subject to tariffs, as much as it pains me to pay it. But in the long run, you're probably better off paying that tariff, and instead of risking customs going after you for making a false declaration and claiming a tariff exemption when it doesn't actually exist.
Your relationship with your broker should be very collaborative.
Correct.
Under DDP shipments, and for those situations where the supplier is offering to absorb some of the duty burden, what advice can you share for companies and suppliers willing to trade under these terms?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We're getting a lot of questions on what to do with DDP. DDP are sales terms where it's delivered duty paid. Essentially, the supplier is saying, we will offer to sell it to you under DDP sales terms. So we're going to be responsible for everything to get it from our factory to your door, including U.S. import declarations and paying for U.S. duties and tariffs. So under those sales terms, the seller, not the importer, is responsible for the import declaration to U.S. Customs. And so they're going to absorb the tariffs. Now, does that free the importer for, they're no longer the importer. Now become the consignee or just the buyer of the imported goods, that the seller is now the importer record. Does that free the U.S. company up from potential liability? Um, it does, because you're no longer in the importer of record seat, but customs can and will go after downstream customers if they smell a fraud scheme. If they think that the downstream customer is somehow involved in a fraudulent scheme, then yeah, you as a customer should run away from that transaction. Yes, the customer is absorbing, taking responsibility for the tariffs, but you still need to see if there's any red flags for being involved in that transaction. You have, less risk, but you still need to be diligent about how you get yourselves involved in these transactions.
So I believe you answered this question already, but I just because it's important and it's changed recently. If we import aluminum bottles and collapsible tubes from China with a 9903 HS code, Trump's latest tariff increase yesterday says 9903. Should we understand that we are affected by the additional 50% tariff?
I believe so. We have not seen, we've only seen the executive order. We haven't actually seen the customs instructions or the customs guidance to come out. Um, but yeah, I think that's the message that we're seeing. That's how we're reading the executive order, is that what was 25% under the 9903 for the steel aluminum tariffs, that's now bumped up to 50%. And there's the wrinkle of the reciprocal tariffs are going to be applied to the balance of the non-aluminum parts of the product there.
If you have vitamins from China and blend them together to make a vitamin premix product, it's still of Chinese origin. However, if you blend the Chinese origin materials and create a blend and then blend them again with US origin materials, would that make it a US origin product?
This is a great example of how the substantial transformation analysis works, right? Because um, customs has looked at questions like medicines, right? If you've got an ingredient that is basically the active ingredient that is, treating the, target disease, and you're using a U.S. origin ingredient, um, and you ship it to another country, let's say Greenland, and there you mix it with other ingredients, you put it in capsules from another country, and then you ship the finished, medicine in one of those little gel caps, back to the U.S. Is that a product of Greenland, or is it a product of U.S. origin? Um, you know, CBP has said, look, because the active ingredient is the essential character of that product, um, and that's active ingredient is U.S. origin, and you're only adding incidental other ingredients, and you're just packaging it in a gel cap that's pretty minor. That's they would say that's probably a U.S. origin medicine there. But on the other hand, you've got mixtures of certain uh, vitamins where you don't necessarily have a essential ingredient. You've got a mix of ingredients. All of them are kind of equally important, and so you can mix different ingredients. And say if you you know have some ingredients from China, some from the US, some from other countries, then you take them to Greenland and that processing, you mix them all together. Sometimes depending on, what your formula is, you come up with a unique blend of those ingredients or something different is coming out of there. There, I think customs could, pretty much say, look, what went into those products are, different ingredients, but um, what comes out of that mixing process is a different product. So we're going to call that, you know, that blend product as a product of Greenland. So it really depends on the specific parts that are going in, what you're actually doing, what kind of processing you're doing in order to determine that country of origin. So, um, just identifying, one or two parts here, ingredients is probably not enough. You need to really get into exactly what you're doing with all those ingredients and what's what's the nature of the product and how does the processing affect that product.
We are not the importer of the goods from India. We buy it from a supplier who imports them. They are increasing the price of those goods that we buy from the U.S. supplier. The question is, they insist the tariff is added to the goods based on the sale date within the 90-day pause and not the arrival date. The supplier is also passing on the tariff after a 90-day pause to 26% plus 10%. Is that right? I wanted to clarify the country-specific tariff after 90-day pause is 26% as of now, but it is to be determined.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because here the supplier and the buyer are trying to figure out what is the cost of the tariff on products that are coming in either during the 90-day window, pause window, or before or after. Here, the the buyer is basically saying, why should I be paying more for products that are coming in the 90-day pause window, which are not subject to the extra tariffs? But the seller is looking like they're trying to add in an amount for the tariffs. So um, again, part of that is I think there's questions on how much of the inventory is going to be potentially subject to the tariffs there. So I think this is a question that buyers and sellers are going through, just trying to figure out what are the true numbers of product that are actually subject to the tariffs. So I think you do need to focus on not just when the tariffs are sold, because just selling them doesn't trigger a tariff. It's only when they're imported could they potentially be subject to a tariff. So you have to check what is the import date? What's your inventory of product that's subject to tariffs? And if you can show that, hey, my overall costs of my inventory have gone up by X dollars because of the tariffs that I had to pay under these DDP terms, that is how the seller would, try to justify, the how much of an increase they were trying to pass through to the customer.
Someone just asked, can you verify that whatever tariff is applied upon arrival is the tariff that was in effect on the date the ship sailed?
When the ship sail is not really effective, you would need to go by, it's like when was the import entry declaration made? So you can guesstimate from, when the ship left the port, how long it takes on the water to get to a U.S. port. From China, it's what, 3 weeks roughly to get to a U.S. port. East Coast, West Coast, may have variations, but to know for certain, you would need to, know when were the entry dates for those entries.
So it doesn't matter when it sailed, it depends on when it was entered into.
Yeah, because transit time can, vary a lot. Sometimes the ship goes to other ports in between on the way, and takes longer. Sometimes they go direct.
And there's a backup right now as well as people are trying to.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, last question. What documents need to be filed for duty drawback?
Wow, duty drawback. Basically, you need to show that whatever you imported, whatever parts that you're, whatever product you're claiming drawback on, you need to be able to document that those actually did get exported out, or that they got fully destroyed, or that, somehow they did not get consumed in the US. So to the extent that you on the first end, you need to have the universe of all your products coming in. So that's all your import entry declarations, all the invoices, for those entry declarations. Then the second part is to the extent they go into the warehousing, right? Whether it's your inventory or you're using a third party inventory, you have to show that whatever you imported went into warehouse, and that the full quantity that goes into the warehouse ultimately either gets re-exported out, or they got destroyed somehow. So, making sure you have a paper trail to show what comes in either went out or got destroyed. So
Okay.
those are the documents that you really need to have to support your duty drawback claims.
All right, great, perfect. Everyone is just knew exactly how many questions to post. So thank you. Our time's up, and I want to thank you again, Adams, for your participation in this. I appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and experience with us. And who knows, based on what keeps happening, maybe we'll have him back again, and we'll do another one of these. On the screen, you'll see our resources page that has information from the first webinar that we did last month on the 2025 tariffs and the follow-up information we talked about today. You can use that QR code to get to that resources page, or just follow the link that I've got listed here on the slide. Thank you again, Adams, for answering our questions, and thank you everyone for joining us, and stay well, everybody.